Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Diane Brockmeyer, the CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who choose to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to help bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Grief support is especially meaningful to me, as it was a tremendous help to my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 7 years old. 20 years later, she still recalls the positive, safe feelings she had with her grief support group. They understood her. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance. For more information about becoming a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I am Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and I'm joined here today with three of my incredible colleagues to talk about childhood and adolescent grief. A little backstory here. Our grief program started in 1999, so for 24-ish years, we've been providing grief camps, grief groups, and individual grief counseling for children, teens, and adults. We are doing this podcast because clients have been asking for it as a platform for support. That's really the foundation of our services, is our community asking for more. We are also so grateful to our community donors who have generously supported us over the years, as all of our services are free of charge. So over these past 24 years, we've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 grief centers that provide grief support to Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Southeast Missouri. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today with 24 plus years experience as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. I've lost my dad, my brother, and my nephew, along with several other family members over an 8-year period. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real life perspective too. Our plan is for episodes to be candid and honest discussions with grievers. But like I said earlier, today we want to start with a real and open talk about what childhood and adolescent grief actually is. So doing that today, we'll be here with 3 of my colleagues, but also this episode will include actual interviews with children and teens talking themselves about childhood and adolescent grief. So first, let's meet 3 of my incredible colleagues who are here with me so we can really process grief and healing that we know happens and have really seen in our work. So, Barbara, you want to start?
Sure. I've been at the Grief Center now for about 12 years as a grief counselor, and I guess, a lot of times people ask why you do this work, and I think working with children, it's just been amazing to be able to see them again as young adults and see that they really do heal and find ways to work through their grief.
Well, very glad you're here with us today, Barbara. Thank you.
I'm Lauren. I've been with the center as a counselor for 10 years, and I volunteered with the camp program for several years prior to that. I really enjoy working with children and adolescents because I feel like they just really have some very unique and powerful ways of expressing their grief, and it's just really rewarding to be able to witness that, be able to witness their healing, and also to give them an opportunity just to be heard. I think that's so often what children and teens need, especially grieving children and teens. And so I think it's just really a special experience to be able to be present for that and a witness for that and to be able to give that to them.
Absolutely, Lauren. Absolutely. Well, thank you for being here today.
And I'm Hannah. So I volunteered with the Centers for Good Grief for 7 years before I came on 2 years ago as a counselor here. And I do this, I guess I'm going to give a little bit more personal answer today. I was a grieving kid myself. Like when I was younger, my mom died, and I know that I would have really, really benefited from services like this when I was a kid. So it's really rewarding to me to be able to show up for our children and adolescents and our teens and just really provide this really helpful and healthy work environment that they need with their grief. And so that's been just really rewarding for me to see them receive that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that too, Hannah, and really glad you're here today. And that's really something that we're going to talk about in this episode is things that we see. Barbara touched on it when you were introducing yourself as well about we've had the benefit of seeing so many of our children grow into young adults, and a lot of times their vocational choices have been impacted by their grief. So you're kind of already setting us off. So thank you. Well, again, just so glad the three of you are here today to talk about this. Obviously, this is our program started with Camp Good Grief with working with children, and it has obviously grown, like I said, but we wanted to really focus specifically on children and adolescents today. And so let's just jump in. Our very first podcast episode was all about just sort of grief in general, but we're going to just really focus that in today on our children. And so let's start there with what is grief and, maybe what are the unique factors of childhood and adolescent grief?
Well, grief is all the thoughts and feelings that you have running through your mind and body when someone close to you dies. And that's just sort of the simple explanation of grief. And I think with children, they do grieve differently from adults. It depends on their age and their understanding of death. And children may go from crying 1 minute to playing the next. They don't always have the words to express their feelings. So you really have to pay attention to their behaviors, and you have to give them other outlets to express their emotions, like drawing pictures or looking at photos can be helpful. And then when you look at teens, they're individuals, and their grief is individual as well. They'll grieve for different lengths of time and express a wide range of emotions. And for many teens, they're already working on becoming more independent and separating from their parents, which means they tend to maybe reach out to their friends more than family. And they may feel a flood of emotions, and it may feel overwhelming and confusing at times. So I think it's just important to validate their feelings and offer them as many opportunities as possible to express themselves. So that's just a little bit about the uniqueness of the grief.
Definitely, their development plays such a role in that. And then we're going to get into this about how that changes and how their grief changes as they continue to grow and change. So, well, many people come to the Baptist Centers for Good Grief asking a lot of questions about the stages of grief. Maybe a checklist so that they can feel better faster. A lot of times family members will ask us if a child is going to grieve forever or be sad forever. And we'll get to that. But before we do, I think it's important to really just, again, look at what childhood and adolescent grief looks like. And you said it, Barbara. Grief is a very unique individual experience. However, we all grieve in 5 ways. And so, for example, physically, so how might children have physical reactions to grief? And sometimes what we see is headaches or upset stomachs. Sometimes those reactions come too maybe after there's been an intensity of emotions, then all of a sudden they don't feel well or their tummies hurt and things like that. And physical reactions are things that we need to pay attention to. We need to talk to a pediatrician and things like that. But we also, I think it's important to remember that our body is so connected to our grief, and that sometimes, especially you said, Barbara, children don't always have the words. So sometimes because they don't have the words, they can't say, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling nervous. So it might come across through this pattern of upset stomachs and things like that. So we have to really watch those physical reactions.
Yeah, and we also grieve cognitively. So those are our thoughts. That's the head part of the grief experience. And so what that can look like, and really this is for anybody, children or adults, can be difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, maybe replaying certain thoughts or questions or images in their minds over and over again. And so how that might look in children is you may find them coming to you and asking some of the same questions over and over again. And for adults, that can be challenging sometimes because some of those questions don't have easy answers. And that's something that we hear a lot from parents and guardians. How do I support my child? How do I answer their questions? I don't think it's sinking in. But that's just a very natural part of the grief process. Adults experience that as well. It's just part of our brain trying to wrap itself around what's happened.
And our heart is a big piece of that too, right? We grieve emotionally, and that's what we think about most commonly, I think, is the emotional piece of grief. And, we think about what are the 3 emotions we can really name as adults, let alone as children: mad, sad, happy, right? And so it's important to think about those other emotions also that kids have. Of course, they feel mad, they feel sad, they feel happy. But there's also a lot of other emotions, like, some harder ones we talk about at the center are regret, relief, things like that. And kids feel that even if they don't have the words to express it, like you were saying, Angela. And so it is really important to talk about that with our kids, these harder feelings, because sometimes people we have like a more complicated relationship with, they die too. And so we may feel regret or relief or anger.
And Hannah, too, I think another emotion would be fear. And so sometimes you see, especially if they've lost a parent, there's that fear of who else might die. And so fear is one of those real hard emotions that sometimes the kids will express.
Absolutely. And they show those feelings in their actions and in their behaviors. And so we grieve behaviorally. And so there's a wide range of what that could look like. This really applies for adults and children, but you may find that there's a loss of interest in things that used to be important to you. Maybe your priorities change. Maybe you feel drawn to certain behaviors or activities that, weren't something of interest before, but maybe now help you to feel connected with your loved one or feel very meaningful now. And also with children and teenagers, we may see things like acting out behaviors. Their world has been turned upside down. They're testing their boundaries. They're trying to figure out what the structure of their world is at now and how to make sense of that. And so sometimes they test those boundaries, and we may see, various, emotional outbursts, behavior outbursts, disobedience, acting out. For older kids, possibly some risk-taking behaviors, alcohol, other substance use, things like that. And two, when we think about substance use, that's also can be an attempt to lessen the pain and to cope with the pain. And so, again, we just sort of see these wide range of behaviors that all fall under what we would consider natural, normal grief, even if they aren't always the most healthy ways of coping.
And spiritually, too, is a way that we grieve, even kids. And I don't think that we think of that at first with kids, especially, these adolescents and teenagers. But those big why questions, and kids ask why all the time, right? That's kind of a novelty of kids is why? And, they'll ask why in their grief, and we as adults have those same questions. Why did this happen? Why me? All those big whys. And that falls underneath that spirituality of our grief. And then, of course, connected to our higher power, our religion, our faith, thinking about, some people feel a strengthening in their faith, a connection, but also we can have a loss of faith or a questioning of faith. And that can happen for adolescents and teens too.
Hannah, I think those why questions are some of just the most challenging ones for grieving people because there's not those easy answers for them.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes we see that children and adolescent, maybe their struggles with spirituality are oftentimes hard to discuss within the family, maybe out of fear that they're doing something different than what the family believes, or that they're going to disappoint their family from having these questions. But I think, again, that's where we have to remember that these 5 areas, physical, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual, are all common, normal ways of expressing grief. We expect them, and we should see them, and you should feel them. So saying that is, grief is not just being sad or crying, obviously. It's a full body experience. We just kind of laid that out there. And children grieve in spurts. So that's something we really have to remember. One way I kind of like to think about that, and what I've learned over the years, is they haven't really been contaminated by the world yet. They still have that just childlike innocence, and so they just kind of are a little bit more accepting sometimes of things. But in saying that, they also know, okay, that's all I can do. That's as intense as I can be, and I have to stop and I have to go run and play. And that's why as adults, a lot of times children's grief is really hard to understand, because at one minute they're very upset and they're expressive, and then they look like they're fine, and you expect them to be fine, and then all of a sudden they may not be again. So again, they really do grieve in spurts.
As adults, we don't shift gears so quickly, right?
Right.
So then we're like, what just happened, when
Right.
when they make that shift so quickly.
Can you just say how old you are and what grade you're going into?
I'm 8 and I'm going into 3rd grade.
And you went to Camp Good Grief this summer?
Yes.
Great. So glad you're here.
I'm 12 and I'm going into 7th grade, and I went to Good Grief Camp.
Great. Well, at Camp Good Grief, we talk about how it's a different type of camp than any other camp there is out there. And we talk about what makes camp unique. Do either of you remember what makes it unique?
We share with other people with their grief and relate and get to know people that have probably been with the same experience but not exact same experience as us.
Absolutely, yeah. So we share our grief, and I love how you said that. It's like we're with people who also have grief, but it's not the same exact as ours, because all of us have our own unique experience. What was your kind of most memorable part of being at Camp Good Grief? What's something that has really stuck with you?
It's probably all the fun crafts that we did that helps me express myself.
What craft in particular did you enjoy doing?
I love the keepsake box.
Oh, good, the memory box. What did you do with it when you got home?
I put it under my bed.
Okay, good. What about you?
I had an amazing buddy, and she was really nice to me, and it was nice to experience with that and get to know someone and someone be with me during this whole time of this camp. And then the balloon release was great.
Tell me about the balloon release.
The balloon release, you had a yellow balloon, you put a name tag, and you wrote your loved one's name or a memory or your name or just something about them, or just put your name, and then you would go outside and you just release it in there. You can watch it float away, and then once it passed the trees, it's like that feeling is almost gone but not gone, but it gives you a sense of relief for that moment.
Did you feel a sense of connection at that time too?
Yes.
Okay. And your buddy. Talk to me about your buddy.
My buddy was Olivia. She was super kind and was always trying to help and get me in the mood and hyped. She was just always, she wasn't just like, keep the conversation low, don't talk to me at all, just sometimes. She was always talking, and that was great. That's not a bad thing to actually talk to me. I would like to be talked to. I don't like starting conversations, so it was great hearing that she was interacting with me.
And what was different about Olivia? Do you remember? She was a former camper?
Yes, she was a former camper.
So she was a former camper, now volunteer. What was that like for you, knowing that, okay, she's been kind of in my shoes before?
It felt good that I have someone that was this and was a buddy that knew, and not almost felt the same, but like was still there to know.
Right. And being respectful, it sounds like, is really important to you. Respectful that this is my story. Yeah. What have you found helps you the most with your grief?
When I draw pictures and tell stories so I can always remember.
So a lot of memory sharing.
Yes.
Yeah. What's one of your favorite best memories?
It was one on Christmas.
A Christmas memory. Have you written about that or drawn a picture of it?
I drew a picture.
Good. I think that's really important to capture those moments so you remember them forever. Tell me a little bit about counseling. What's it been like with your counselor?
We do fun things to express our feelings, and she helps me to remember memories and draw pictures. We also do fun activities to sometimes, when I'm sad, to take my mind off it.
What are your thoughts?
My counselor has helped me with talking on some hard subjects, but still nice subjects after, so we don't go straight into the, hard subjects. We talk about normal life, so it's not always grief, therapy. We talk like we were friends, so it feels nice to be like, instead of being like, all right, let's head in. So we talk on every day, not every day, but it's like every day, week, stuff, and then normal. And she helps with some problems outside of therapy sometimes that I've been having trouble with, and that's great. So it helps too.
What do you think family members need to know about grieving kids? Like, what do you think families should know?
My family members, I would like to tell them is, some of my family members seem to not really talk about, which is fine, but it's kind of helpful to know, hey, I'm still thinking about it and I'm still here. But if I haven't heard some of my family members, especially the male ones, talk about her, they just seem like she isn't here anymore, so it doesn't matter, or they moved on. So mostly my grandma, my aunt, and my dad has helped me get through this. But most of my male family members seem to not. I think they're still grieving, but I'd like to hear memories I didn't know, especially from the ones that knew her as a kid. But they don't seem to talk about her much, so it's disappointing. But I don't mean to be mean to them, so I'm not disappointed in them.
Yeah. But I like that. Sometimes I think adults, we don't know as much about grief as people think that we should, Sometimes adults try really hard to not upset kids, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this. We want people to know what grief is and what we really need to help us. Are you going to grieve forever?
I don't know, because sometimes I'm grieving, sometimes I'm not.
I'd say with me, you never really move on from grief. It's always with you, but at the same time you accept. You accept this happened to you, and you accept why these emotions are happening to you. You don't move on, you don't forget, and sometimes you will be sad once you move on. Sometimes you will be angry. But at the same time, you accept this happened, and you don't move on, but it's sort of a moving on, but it's still with you. But you still kind of move on and take a break, and it's not there as much.
That's what's so important to us at the Centers for Good Grief, is that what you just said, you hit the nail on the head again, is that we do want to live our lives. We want to have good lives, but we want to remember. And that's why your pictures and your drawings and all the coping skills you mentioned are so important, because they help us into that future. Before we finish, is there anything about grief you think we should say that we haven't said?
You can forget your family member's voice, hair, the date of dying, their skin, how they felt when you hugged them. I've had that happen, and it was totally a panic meltdown, and it was just a mix of meltdown and panic, and I was just panicking because I couldn't remember when my mom died, and I was panicking, and then I remember I forgot her voice just randomly one day, and I searched through my phone, because it used to be her phone, so I searched through any videos I could find of her talking, so it scared me so much, and it panics, so I would like to keep as many photos and memories as much as I can. So I kind of hoard my memories and stuff. This is actually one of another past member of my family. So I keep a lot of their stuff and hoard it. I don't hoard it, but at the same time I collect their clothes and jewelry and stuff. So
Yeah, that doesn't sound like hoarding. That sounds like keeping special mementos. Sounds like you probably have a lot of pictures.
Well, I do have a lot. Well, not a lot, but I do have some. And sometimes I forget parts of memories. So that's why a picture that I have on my phone of me, my brother, and my mom, I wanted to get like printed out into like a frame.
Yeah.
So I can always remember her.
Yes. That'd be a great idea. Yeah. We need to make that happen.
I would like to, there's a lot of things that I'd like to add out there. Don't say you know what they're going through. That's one of my most, not, I'll literally, stare at them and, stare them down, what did you just say? And then any, sort of, Happy Grandparents' Day or, Happy Mother's Day, Happy Father's Day, I would like teachers to know that they don't need to change it. They can still do the activity, but they're still kids that don't have their father around, don't have their mother around, don't have their grandparents around. So they don't need to they can normalize it, but they don't need to get rid of the activity. I'd just like them to be like, you can do this for your aunt, you can do this for your uncle, instead of being straightforward of mother only, but you know.
Yeah. I think another area that we really need to explore just to really help our listeners with understanding childhood and adolescent grief is kind of just talking through some myths. Now, these were myths that have been written by Dr. Alan Wolfelt, and he's a very good friend of ours at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. Our whole center is built on his model, but I think these are important for the listeners to hear, and just again to help them understand with maybe what they're seeing with their children and teens, because it sometimes feels very different than it does for us as adults.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of these are things that in society we commonly believe and we're sort of brought up to believe. But I think, it might be helpful for us to challenge some of those a little bit. And one example is that a child's grief and mourning is short in duration. And so what I think is important to keep in mind is that children, they really have the same grief needs as adults do, generally speaking. But how they meet those needs looks different, and how that grief presents itself may look different. And as Angela said, in many ways, children are better grievers than adults, because they do have that ability to naturally, what we call dose themselves with their grief, where they can go there when they need to and then be able to step away from it when they need to, and find that natural balance. But this can also be confusing, because when they're running and playing and looking like a normal child, it can appear that it's not bothering them, when actually it is. It's just that's their way of coping, is they have times where they lean into it and then times where they step away from it. And I think one thing also that's important to keep in mind when we think about the timeline of children's grief, and Barbara touched on this earlier, is that, grief, it lasts forever. There's not a point where anybody stops grieving, but it does change over time. And for children especially, they process their grief in accordance with where they are developmentally. And so as children grow and reach new developmental stages, they often reprocess their grief in new ways based on where they are at that time. And so what we may see is that a child processes their grief as they're able to at the age that they are. Let's say they're 10, and they process their grief as much as they're able to at that point in time. And then later on, maybe when they become a teenager, maybe when they graduate high school and start college, they find themselves processing their grief again. And sometimes they may experience a renewed intensity in their grief, because they're able to look at it in different ways. And so, grief truly is a lifelong experience. And that doesn't mean that they haven't coped well, or they haven't processed their grief, or they haven't done what they were supposed to do, maybe initially after the loss happened. It just means that that's very natural for them to experience their grief in new ways as they get older.
And I know, Lauren, I just remembered I saw a child when she was 10 and she lost her mom. And then when she turned 16, she came back to the center as she was struggling with identity issues and just, like you said, just had a better understanding or was searching for a better understanding of what happened to her mom and what does that mean to me. And now as a young adult, she's trying to find ways to give back that continues to help with her healing. And so it's just, I think what you said is just so true.
Yeah, and Barbara, I think that really reinforces for me how natural it is and how much wisdom kids have in their grief, right? They very naturally conduce their grief. They very naturally go through these developmental stages that changes their grief. And there's kind of this beauty and this wisdom that the kids have with their grief.
Absolutely.
So another thing that is a myth is that infants and toddlers are too young to grieve and mourn. And I just think the best way that Alan Wolfeld has even described that is if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve and mourn. And so we do need to remember that even with our smallest of children, they do grieve. It's just, again, kind of going along with what Lauren said. They're going to re-grieve, and they're going to need the adults in their lives to help them with their grief, to help them with memories and really teaching them about their loved one. But yes, they do, in fact, grieve and mourn, and sometimes we see that in their very young ages through maybe some of those physical and behavioral reactions we talked about earlier.
And I guess another myth is that children are not affected by the grief and mourning of the adults who surround them. And of course, kids pick up so quickly messages, and it can be the message of it's not okay to talk about the loved one and it's not okay to show emotion, or it can be the opposite, that it is okay, that we want to remember this person, we want to talk about the person who died. So yes, they're definitely affected by those around them.
And I think that's just a point we have to make really clear here. We hope our listeners can hear this, just to know that, and like what Lauren has said too, that we as adults grieve and our grief matters as well. And it looks and has the same needs a lot of times as that we're talking about here, but we need our adults to take care of their grief and to take care of themselves. That's going to be the best thing that you can do to help your grieving child. And I think we need that message highlighted here in this episode.
And that doesn't mean hiding your grief either. That
Yes.
doesn't mean that you have to keep your grief hidden away and that kids can't see it because it'll affect them in a negative way. Because actually modeling your grief for kids is so important, showing them that it's okay to express those emotions.
Yeah, because many times I'll tell parents it's okay to cry in front of your child. It's okay to show emotion. If you're going to have one of those days where you're just having a breakdown and just totally emotional, maybe you don't do that in front of your child. But just showing that you are sad and saying, yes, I'm sad, and it's okay to be sad.
And what a reassurance of you're not alone in this, right? Like mom or dad or grandmother, whoever, I'm sad too. You're not alone in all these hard feelings.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite myths to talk about, and I know that sounds crazy, but it is truly my favorite, is the trauma of childhood bereavement always leads to a maladjusted life. And that is absolutely, absolutely a myth. And I think the four of us sitting here could probably tell 30 stories off the top of our head of how we have seen our children grow up in our program and become young adults and debunk this myth for sure. And so can the trauma of childhood bereavement lead to a maladjusted life? Absolutely, it can. That's really one of the reasons our centers are here, is because we know that can happen. But we know that if children and teenagers are given a supportive place, trained people, supportive people, and the opportunity to do their grief work, they will not be set up for life to live a horrible, terrible life. They can heal. We have seen that. And I just think that, again, is really important for the adults and grieving children's lives to hear, that if they are given the space and the opportunity to do their grief work with support and love, they can heal and live a really healthy, good life.
Sometimes people, in an attempt to protect children, feel like it's better if they don't attend funerals. They worry about, the effect that would have on children. But I think it's important to keep in mind that funerals serve a function. There's a reason why funerals are such a part of our society that's just so integrated into our processing of death and grief. Funerals create a ritual. It creates a structure for us to openly remember the person who died, for us to begin to process our loss and our grief, and it gives us an opportunity to receive support from the people we love and the people who also love the person who died. And children benefit from all of these things just as adults do. However, children do need to be prepared for funerals. Especially because, for some of them, it may be their first experience with it. They may not know what to expect or how to put it into any kind of context. And so we want to make sure that we sit down with children ahead of time and talk with them about funerals and let them know exactly what to expect. So go through step by step what they will see and what will happen. Give them words for things that may be unfamiliar, like casket or urn. If it's an open casket, let them know that they will see their loved one, but they may not look exactly the same. And let them know that it may look like that they're asleep, but that they're not asleep and that they can't wake up. And explain to them that what they're seeing is their loved one's body and it's just their body. And that when a person dies, they don't need their body anymore. And that it doesn't hurt when their loved one is put into a casket or buried or cremated. And so be sure to emphasize that it's not painful for them. And that's, of course, where you can incorporate any spiritual beliefs of your family as well. And also, I think it's important when it comes to children and funerals to hear from them what their wants are, what their needs are, and try to give them as much choice as you can. So ask them what they do and do not want to be a part of when it comes to the funeral. Ask them if there's anything that they would like to, get to have a say in picking out, or if anything that they really want to include as part of the funeral, whether that's, certain pictures or songs or anything like that they want to put their special touch on. And I think a lot of times it's also helpful to assign a trusted adult who's not who doesn't need to be immediately involved in the whole funeral process, but somebody the child knows and trusts who can kind of be in charge of the child and just focus on the child. And so that way, if the child needs a break, if it gets to be too much, if they need to step out, then that adult can be with them and do that with them.
A couple of practical things that I think are helpful too is based on the age of the child is take a bag of stuff for them to do. When my grandfather died, I had paper and crayons and markers for my younger cousins, and they sat there and busily made, probably 20 different pictures, and then immediately took them to the casket and put them in there with him. And that bothered a couple of family members, like, that doesn't need to be in there with him. And so we kind of had to address that it's okay. It's their way of being a part of it. And something else I've heard from many clients, as adults, maybe reflecting back on their childhood, maybe the first funeral they ever went to was family members kind of forcing them to hug or touch the deceased. And again, that can be very alarming for a child when they don't even maybe understand what all is happening. So again, I think just like you said, Lauren, all those practical tips of explaining to them and giving them the choice.
And I think, too, sometimes people think if the kids are running around or drawing or doing those things that they're not affected, it's just they're not grieving. And I think that's just, like we've said, that's just the child's way of coping.
And if we go back historically, when bodies were left in the living room for several days, that is what happened. Children ran around, and death was a natural part of family and life, and that's kind of what's happened in our culture as, we have placed more distance between the family and rituals and grief.
Well, and I think one of our biggest myths that we run into, I would think you guys maybe agree with this, is that tears are a sign of weakness, and they're maybe even harmful in the long run for kids. And we know that this is a myth, right? Like, tears are so healing, and tears do a couple things for us. One, they're a sign like, hey, I need support, right? I'm crying, come to me, come support me. And so they're a sign to the people we love that we're grieving, we're hurting, and that we need support. And also, tears release stress hormones. They release natural things in our body, natural painkillers really in our body that help us when we're hurting. And so modeling those tears, like we said, is helpful for our kids. You know, we don't want to have a come apart and not be able to get up off the ground, but modeling tears for our kids is important. And also, not falling into some of these, I think, natural things that we do just because we're taught them, like, saying things like, don't cry, or, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, and trying to stop those flood of tears as quickly as possible. And usually that comes from, I think, a place of care. And I think that comes from a place of concern because we don't want to see our kids hurting. It hurts to see our kids hurting. And just remembering and allowing ourselves to hit that pause button and say, okay, this is a valuable thing that they're doing. These tears serve a purpose right now.
And those messages like boys don't cry, be strong, be tough. I mean, a lot of times families really kind of hold on to the fact that we are a strong family. And so maybe kind of re-identifying what that means in our family is an important thing as well.
And not everybody does cry.
Right.
Not everybody has that need. And so that's okay too. If children don't cry, that doesn't mean that they're not grieving. I think what's important to keep in mind is just the value of grief expression, and tears are one form of that. That we want for children and teens to be able to express their grief, to take whatever that internal experience and show it outside of themselves in some way, whether that's tears or some other way.
Yeah, and I think sometimes adults feel like they should instantly, just naturally, know how to help their children when they're grieving. And you don't. I think it's a learning process, and I think that's where it's valuable to listen to podcasts and, try to find out more information, because there's no right or wrong to it. And, the goal is not to help your child get over their grief, because as an adult, that's not possible. So it's helping them to learn to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, for our listeners, we couldn't sit around this table if we had not seen that, and we have seen that, and our kids have shown us that over the years, that they are able to do that. They are able to live with it. And Barbara, I loved what you were talking about, that former client who now is, as a young adult, is looking for ways to give back. And I think that's an important thing to see, that her grief has just changed so much over the years. Yeah.
And I think it's important, too, as a parent to be able, or a guardian, to be able to kind of pivot with the way you're supporting your kid. We just listed 8 myths, and it's a possibility that one of those myths you thought was true, because they're the myths we listed for a reason. They're very, common. And so staying curious and learning more about grief and learning more about how to support your kid and not beating yourself up, because it's likely that this is the first time you've ever supported your kid through grief. And so it's a learning process for you and for your kid.
Absolutely. That's a really great point, Hannah, because these myths are something that we all spend a lot of time on educating people. And so, if that's something that somebody thought was true, again, that's why we have to kind of arm ourselves with information and knowledge, and be kind and gentle to ourselves, because we're grieving too.
I was just going to say, so much of the grief process in general, I think, is a learning process, and it's okay not to have it all figured out right off the bat.
And I was just going to say that, family traditions play a huge part of this, of what the traditions have been in your family. And, that sort of guides you. And sometimes you have to rethink those and do, like Lauren says, it's a process of learning.
So we asked some of our families about what are some questions you want us to cover in a podcast. What are some of the things that maybe you all really struggled with? And so they gave us some questions. So we're going to dive into those questions now. So the first question, which we get a lot, I would probably say a lot of our first phone calls have this, is how do I even begin to talk with my child about death and grief?
Right. And I think for me, just a really good rule of thumb with this is to be simple, direct, and honest on an age-appropriate level. So, we want to speak very simply. You don't want to overwhelm children with information. Give them the information that they need at that moment, let them process that, and then, you can talk more later or answer more questions later. When talking with children about grief, it's important to be very direct. Children are just very literal and concrete thinkers. They don't have the same language ability that adults do. They don't, depending on where they are developmentally, they don't necessarily have the ability to think in abstract ways. And so as adults, we tend to soften our speech, especially when talking about hard things like death. We may use various, euphemisms and figures of speech to soften the subject. But for children, that can be confusing. And they actually really respond well to very simple, direct language. And so it's okay to use words like dead and die and death. Those words sound very harsh to our ears as adults, and we assume that children will feel that way as well. But they actually really respond well to those words. And if they are said in a just a very normal and informative way, it doesn't have that connotation of being too harsh for them. It gives them the language that they can use to begin to process what has happened. It's also important with children to be honest. And this can be challenging too, especially, if the circumstances of the death were such that, it's a challenging topic, things like suicide or, deaths related to substance use or a number of other things where the circumstances of the death make it such that we maybe don't want to give children the full information. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that children are very observant. They hear things, they pick up on things. If something is not being said to them or is being said to them in a way that doesn't feel congruent with how everybody's acting and what else is going on, kids pick up on that. And sometimes, too, they may actually hear things. They may either overhear conversations or another family member may say something to them that you didn't think that they would, and they may find out information other ways. You want for them to know that they can come to you for honest information and that you will tell them. And of course, that's on an age-appropriate level. Again, you don't have to tell them more than they need to know, but you also don't want to tell them something that's untrue. I think one thing that can be helpful when thinking about this is that children can process what they know. They cannot process what they don't know. And so if we omit certain important pieces of information, or if we tell them something that's untrue, then what they do is they start to try to connect the dots based on, what they do know, what they've picked up. And sometimes they can connect those dots in ways that we would never even imagine that they would. And sometimes, their interpretation of a situation can, be more difficult for them than just knowing the truth. That when they hear the truth and it's presented to them in a gentle and direct way, then they can begin to process it, and that's how they can begin to heal.
I think that's very true, especially when you're talking about the words that you use, because if you say someone went to sleep, then a child may think, well, if I go to sleep, am I going to die? Or will someone else in my family die? Or the same thing with the concept of heaven. They think of heaven as a place you can go, just like to the store. You go to heaven. So I think it's just very important, like you said, to be aware of the language that you use.
And this is a scary thing for parents. I do a lot, I think we all do, but a lot of prep with parents to have these conversations with their kids. And I think it's okay that you feel a little nervous about this, and to keep in mind this is building, one, of course, trust with your child. I know you already have that, but maintaining that trust. And then also that's establishing kind of that feeling of safety, like, oh, mom or dad or guardian, whoever, they're going to give me the information I need to help me feel safe and help me understand what's going on in this experience that I've possibly never experienced before.
And then you know that they'll come to you with any future questions that they have. And that's how you can kind of have an idea of where they are as far as coping with their grief.
And I think, too, just remembering that talking about death can start early on, because flowers wilt and die, bugs die, and start that process when they're very young of talking about death and making it a normal process.
Absolutely. And I think just to take this particular question, because we do spend so much time, Hannah, as you mentioned, prepping families for these discussions, I think just, again, from a practical standpoint, having this conversation with a child in a place that's comfortable to them. A lot of times we'll talk to families and they may be on their way to pick up children from school and they know they've got to tell them, this really, really hard, sad news. And, I'll usually encourage them to go home, to, don't sit somewhere you don't normally sit in the house, but sit somewhere that's comfortable and, and take that deep breath and say, I have something really hard, really sad to share with you. Grandma died. And what I usually encourage families to do at that point is to stop talking, breathe, let it sink in. That's the other thing. We've sometimes had a few minutes for this to sink in. We've got to give children time to let that sink in. And then, again, just slowly, kind of sharing this information. So I think from a practical steps and just knowing the work that we do, this is sometimes some of the most frequent conversations we have with folks.
Absolutely.
And I think kids, they tell us all the time that
Yes.
they knew something was up.
Yes.
All these cars were at their house.
Yes.
People were crying, but nobody told them anything. So,
Yes.
but they knew something was up. So I think you're exactly right, Angela, just being open and telling them what is going on.
In the day and age we live in,
Yes.
if we don't give them the truth, age appropriate truth, someone else is going to control this narrative, and it's
The
not going to be
internet,
us
social
or
media.
an older cousin,
Yes.
someone at school.
Yes.
Someone is going to control the narrative, and we want to control that in a healthy, supportive way for our kids.
So, in that light, because that's really heavy, and these are some of the things that are so scary to adult caregivers of children, let's go back to that question. Will grieving children and teens be sad forever?
No. That's a simple answer, of course. We find that the pain does lessen over time. Will they ever get over the loss of a significant loved one in their life? Of course not. We don't want them not to remember their loved one. So, yes, and they will re-grieve, and like Lauren said before, they may, as they develop, they may have more questions about death or what does it mean or how that death impacted their life. They'll continue to do that probably the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. So what are some normal ways? We talked about how we all grieve in these 5 different ways, but let's talk a little bit about how we see children's grief, how they present that to us.
So children, again, like adults, they just really feel pretty out of sorts when they're grieving. And they may not even be able to put their finger on what feels out of sorts or exactly what they're feeling or why they're feeling that way. It's just that everything feels different now. The rug's been ripped out from under them. Everything feels like it's been turned upside down. And because it's such a new experience, there may be this feeling of, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. And they may not fully understand where they fit in these new dynamics and in this new world. And so it's definitely just a period of great change and great adjustment, and you see that in their reactions. What we see with children is sometimes some of the same grief reactions that we see with adults, but some that are pretty unique. Barbara mentioned before that children may have fear after someone they love has died, just increased anxiety, worry about something else bad happening or something happening to somebody else they love, or worry what's going to happen to them, worry that something's, that they may die or be hurt as well. And so it's not uncommon to see that anxiety. And with children, that may show up as heightened clinginess, maybe some regressive behaviors. We may see children, use baby talk or just act more immature, maybe even have toileting problems after they've been potty trained. And that clinginess is something that I think we see often, that they just want to be close to their family members, that they may worry a lot more when they're gone. Sometimes we'll hear adults say that their child is calling and then texting them, 10 times while they go to the grocery store, and they just need that reassurance. And we also see them having problems sleeping sometimes, maybe either difficulty falling asleep or nightmares. A lot of times we hear about children and teenagers wanting to share sleep in the same room with their adult and with their family members, and they don't want to be alone at night. And so, we'll see that there's just that need for that physical closeness because there's reassurance that comes with that. I mentioned before that kids may have some acting out behaviors. They might test boundaries. You may see them engage in activities that are an attempt to feel in control. So behaviors where it just seems like they're being defiant, where they really want things to be a certain way or their way. And a lot of times what that is everything in their life right now feels outside of their control. This really bad thing happened that was outside of their control, and it's natural for them to want to feel that sense of control and to have a say in what's going on in their life. And, again, everything feels off, everything feels different, and they really want to have things be the same. And so when supporting a grieving child, I think that it's helpful to have as much stay constant as possible, whether that's schedules, routines. Obviously, sometimes that's limited, just depending on the circumstances of your loss. Sometimes there's a lot of things that may change for that child. They may have to go live in a different home. They may have to go to a different school. There may be a lot of those changes, but as much as possible, keeping anything constant that you can is helpful because that is comforting to the child. That's reassuring. That's something that they can lean on and that they can bank on and that feels familiar. And one other thing about children that we see is that they will often show their grief in their play. Play is the language of children. They don't have the language abilities that adults do. And so that's how they communicate. That's how they process their grief, is through their play. That can feel alarming for adults sometimes. If they're seeing a child playing with toys and there's themes of death in that play, or if it looks like they're kind of replaying the circumstances of their loved one's death, that can feel alarming to adults. They don't know what to make of that. And I think it can be helpful to know that that's a very natural, normal process for children, because that's again their way of processing what has happened, of beginning to make sense of it, of beginning to integrate it into their lives, and just to communicate where they are with their grief. So I think it's very important to pay attention to that and be aware of it, and even be present for that. Ask them questions about it. But it doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean that it's a cause for alarm.
As you were talking, I was thinking about one of a child we had at camp, and he could not sleep. Since the death of his dad, he could not sleep in his own bed. He just refused to. He was just scared. And after coming to camp and having a place where he could talk about his dad and talk about his feelings, his mom was so surprised when he came home. He started sleeping in his bed again. So I just think that's a wonderful example of, allowing children to have that expression, and then they're able to monitor their behavior, change some of their behaviors.
And I think sleep is important because as adults, that's a way that sometimes our grief will present itself and show up is at night when we finally slow down. And the same for children. And so that's sometimes where that fear response will kick in. And again, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Lauren, because I think that's, again, something we talk about with so many families is they will not likely sleep with you in the same bed until they're 16, but it is a need they have right now. And I think if we think about it that way, like this is a need they have, and how it's a need of security and safety, and how can I help them with this?
And I think a piece that Lauren touched, and also going along with security and safety, parents also often ask about, should I still expect the same rules? Should I still hold the same rules for my kids? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, we need to have some compassion and some understanding of their grief reactions and all those things, but that provides a sense of safety. It provides a sense of control. Okay, the same rules are still in play, right? I can throw my ball down the bowling alley and I'm still going to have the bumpers up, right? I'm not going to fall into the gutters. Some of the same rules are still there.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think sometimes families will think that, maybe we're encouraging that, grieving children just can kind of get away with things. And that's not what we are encouraging. That's not what they need. They need to know that limits are there and structure, because it equals safety. I think we just cannot say that enough. And everything about the world feels unsafe. So we have to maintain, and that's, again, just to echo what Lauren said about even just a schedule, because, maybe the person who died is who picked them up after school. And so that may be something that's changed. And now they have to go to aftercare and all of these things. And some things we can't immediately correct and fix. But what are some other types of things that we can continue that can feel like part of the normal routine or schedule?
And sometimes that may mean asking the child,
That's
you
right.
know, what they would like, what would be helpful for them. And, I think it's just such a tricky line to walk for parents and guardians, that line of keeping that structure in place, but doing it in a gentle way, in a flexible way, in an understanding way. There does have to be a degree of flexibility, but again, that structure is so important. And so I think it comes down a lot to approach. You have the structure in place, you have the expectations, you have the consequences that the child is familiar with, but you can deliver it in a way that's gentle and understanding, and allow time to sit down and talk with them about it and explain to them and talk with them, hey, buddy, what's going on? It seems like you're feeling pretty angry. I'm feeling angry too. I'm angry about a lot of things right now. And
that is important, because oftentimes when a grieving child is disciplined, the intensity of their response to that discipline can increase. And it's probably the fact that I don't like that I'm being disciplined, but there is grief in there too. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, yes, the delivery and the discussion, have to be a little bit more involved. Yeah.
Sometimes I'll have adults say to me that it seems like they only bring up their grief when they get in trouble about something else, and then all of a sudden they're really sad.
Right.
And, it will come across, they are interpreting that as being manipulative. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it might be, kids do that sometimes. But I think what is important to keep in mind is that it's not like our grief happens in a bubble separate from everything else that happens in our life. The way that we feel about things, the way that we react to things, it all is connected. And so when we are upset about one thing, it's very common for other things that we're upset about to come to the surface, and for us to make connections. It may be that a child is upset about this thing that happened that they got in trouble for, and then in their mind they're thinking, if my loved one was here, this wouldn't have happened. Right. And so truly there may be that connection to their grief. It may not just be something that's manipulative to get them, out of getting in trouble.
Yeah, I have a former client I'm thinking of who just was constantly getting in trouble because he didn't want to take the trash out, or he wasn't taking the trash out. But his dad took the trash out, and when Dad died, it became his chore. But what would happen when Dad took the trash out, the son would go outside and would shoot baskets in the driveway, and then Dad would join him, and it was 5 minutes of just the two of them. And he was an adolescent, and he was telling me it was my only time I just had my dad, just the two of us, nobody else. So that was part of why I don't want to take the trash out. It brings all of my grief up. But, I don't think that he maybe consciously had put that together. He couldn't express that to Mom. And so it was becoming just this fight after fight every week. And we were really able to kind of explore that in counseling. Yeah. So they were connected.
Yeah. And I think, too, caregivers have a hard time, I think, disciplining a grieving child because they're so sad. They've lost so much,
Right.
I don't want to put any more on them. And then sometimes they try to overcompensate by buying presents and trying to take them on trips and do things, that, coming from a good place, but not really realizing that the importance of the structure and the discipline is really for their safety and to help them feel secure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about school, because that is a very big part of children's lives. And let's talk about how grief impacts school.
Well, kids spend most of their time at school. That's where a lot of their grief will come out. We talked about all the different ways that grief shows up, those 5 ways that we talked about at the top of the episode. And so it's important, I think, number one, to make sure that the teachers and the guidance counselors or social workers at your child's school know that they're grieving. I think it's important for you as a caregiver to reach out to the school and not put that expectation on the kiddo to share that with their teachers and their guidance counselors. Especially what if they're in middle school or something, and then they have to go say that 7 times or 5 times to 5 different teachers. So reaching out to your kid's school and letting them know what's happened, I think, is really important. That will also give the teachers, the guidance counselors, the administration a little bit of context for maybe your child's behavior, because we know that these grief reactions are really normal, and we know that these grief reactions come up, and they're going to come up at school most likely, because that's where our kid spends a lot of time. So when we think about school, the grief reaction or the category of grief reactions that come to mind first for me is cognitively. We have trouble focusing, we have trouble with motivation, things like that. And so it's important to talk about that with your kid and to keep that in mind when, if they are having trouble in school, and not to assume, they're not trying or they're being lazy, they're goofing off. It could be that their grief is really showing up. If I'm thinking about my mom, it's really hard to be thinking about the Spanish War or whatever it is, right? I want to be thinking about my mom, or I want to be looking out the window. Also, kids can get embarrassed when their grief shows up at school. We were talking to just some kids yesterday, and a kiddo told me, I just burst out into tears in the middle of the school day. Just a grief burst just got him. And it was a boy, and he was embarrassed about that. And so providing if the school can provide a space or provide a safe person for your grieving child. So, my grief's coming, I can go to the guidance counselor's office, or I can go to just the school office, or maybe my teacher knows I can just go take more bathroom breaks than I used to, because I just need to go splash some water on my face and get myself together. But really, I think partnering with the school, I think, is one of the most important things, letting them in on this kind of care plan for your kid, because they're going to need more support at school.
And like Lauren said, grief doesn't happen in a little bubble. We don't grieve just from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. So, grief's going to show up.
And I had a grandmother recently say that her grandson, who's only like 4 or 5, and it was Mother's Day. And so they had a project to do. Well, his mom had just died. So he made it through the school day, but when he got home, he was very hard to handle. And she knew it was a direct response to what happened in school that day. Yeah. So going forward, she really does see the benefit of letting the teachers know, just for things like that, because I'm sure the teacher may not even been aware of what was going on with the child.
So muffins with mom, donuts with dads, the father-daughter dance, we are not saying that we advocate those things need to stop, but we need preparation. The child needs preparation. And like Lauren said, something we believe so much in, ask the child. Don't just hide it from the child. The child's going to know what's happening, but ask the child, this is coming up. What would you like to do? Would you like to ask someone to, those kinds of things. Because, and again, we were recently talking with one of our volunteers who's a teacher, and I was just really interested listening to him because he said sometimes he's not told. Like, he doesn't know. And I don't know if the family hasn't shared it with the school or administration hasn't shared it with him. And he was saying several times, if I would have known, there's these other things I could have done. And so I think we have to remember that, to not make the assumption that people know, but they do need to know. So why don't we start off, if you want to tell us your name, age, what grade you're going to be in school, just easy, get to know you stuff.
My name is Madison. I'm 15, and I'm going to the 11th grade.
Oh, that's so hard to believe. Talk to me. Do you remember how old you were when you went to camp as a camper?
I was 13.
Okay. And you have come back now to be a volunteer?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start there. Let's start with coming back to being a volunteer. What made you want to do that?
I like the people who were there volunteering when I was at camp, and it just I knew when I was at camp I wanted to come back and help because it was a good environment.
Well, so let's start there. Let's start with grief camp. Do you remember kind of what you were thinking about going to camp?
I didn't want to go.
You didn't want to go?
At all.
So how did you end up at camp? Who made you go?
You
I made you go?
and my dad. Yes.
And why do you think we made you go?
Because it would be helpful and a good experience.
Do you think the not wanting to go, was it nerves? What do you think it was about?
Yeah, it was me being nervous and the bugs.
The bugs, yes. So nervous about what? What were you afraid it was going to be?
Really emotional. Like, I was scared about, like, how I was going to feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I hear from people, when I even talk about the fact that we have a grief camp, they think that we're just going to sit around and cry and be depressed all weekend.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you thought? Oh,
yes.
My gosh, I'm going into this. Okay. So when you left camp, what was the feeling about having experienced it?
I was glad I went, and it was helpful for me to learn about my grief and different coping mechanisms.
Coping mechanisms is huge. I'm glad you mentioned that. Everybody has different coping mechanisms that help. Something that may help me may not help you. Mm-hmm. What helps you cope with your grief?
Crying helps. And when I first lost my loved one, I used to write letters and stuff like that. And now going to the cemetery also helps.
Okay. Those are really good things to mention. And because, the whole point we're doing this podcast is to help, adults out there understand that children really do grieve. Mm-hmm. Teenagers really do grieve. Mm-hmm. And so crying, you mentioned crying, and that crying has helped you. Mm-hmm. How would you explain to someone, because so many people are quick to say, oh, don't cry, or let me give you a Kleenex as soon as you start crying. Explain to people how does crying help you?
I don't know. It's a way for me to get everything I'm feeling out. Mm-hmm. It's like a release.
Okay. You've worked really hard, it sounds like, to find things that help with some soothing, especially with the anxiety. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do those things still work now, or do you find that, different days, maybe you have different coping?
Different days are different coping. Okay. Like, sometimes I still write, and then other days I cry. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just different.
What do you think it is important for adults and family members out there to know about children's grief?
Be patient with them. You should pay attention to their behavior, and if anything changes, because that could be signs of their mental health. Mm-hmm. Just let them know that you're there for them, and be supportive.
What are some things that are not helpful that people do when you're grieving?
Don't tell them that it's not okay to feel how they're feeling. And don't tell them how they're feeling. Like, don't be like, I know you're sad and stuff like that. Like, you should ask them how they're feeling.
That's a very good point. Very good point. We need to teach adults to ask children and teens and not assume.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What do you feel like you learned about your grief at camp? Was there a takeaway about maybe something specific that you learned as a camper?
I learned, like, that it's okay to feel how I'm feeling, and that I should never hold anything, like, inside, and that talking about it helps.
Talk to me about grief counseling. Just kind of, again, what do you think other adults need to know, maybe to help encourage their children to go to counseling?
Let them know that it's a safe space. Like, it's not anything bad, and they're not going to be judged.
So one thing that families worry about with grieving children is that they're going to grieve forever and be sad and not have a happy life, and lots of worries about that. Are you still grieving?
Yes.
How long are you going to grieve?
Probably forever.
Forever, right. I think that's important for people to know, right? How does your grief show up now, these days?
It's different. Like, some days I just miss them a lot, and then other days I may see a picture or, like, I just start thinking about them.
Mm-hmm. But it feels a little different now.
Yes.
Okay. But it's still there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The longing and the missing, right? So let's also talk about something that kind of goes hand in hand with school, but also just, grieving children and adolescents in general, and that is self-esteem. And how does grief impact self-esteem? Because that's something sometimes as the adults we can really see.
Absolutely. And this is a big one. Oftentimes we do define ourselves by the relationships in our lives, right? I'll say, oh, well, I'm a daughter and I'm, I don't know, I'm making this up, but I'm a teacher, or I'm a this or that, right? You define yourself so much by the people you love. And then when you lose someone who's so close to you and you love so much and maybe fills a lot of that kind of way you define yourself, you lose a part of yourself. And it is hard to try and understand who you are. And it is hard to understand kind of what's your motivation and things like that. And so children feel this just like adults do. And also we know that children sometimes can start to connect those dots. Like Lauren was saying, if they don't have all that information, and they may feel like, oh, this is my fault that this person died. And we're seeing that a lot with the pandemic, a lot with, oh, who was the first one in our household to get COVID? And, oh, then following kind of, oh, then you, then you, then you. So therefore, this must be my fault. So there's a lot of pieces that come to self-esteem. I feel like I'm a little all over the place because there's so much in this one question, how it affects our self-esteem.
Because I think hands down, 100%, it impacts everyone's self-esteem. Grief impacts everyone's self-esteem. Everyone, especially grieving children and teens, it just crushes their self-esteem. Yeah.
I think for kids and teenagers too, there's so often, especially older kids and teenagers, this fear of being different or of sticking out from their peers. They want so badly to fit in. And so then you've had something happen, and for many kids they may worry that they're the only one, or maybe they are the only one in their class who's experienced a loss like that, and it makes them different, and that affects their self-esteem. That's one reason why I think, when we have opportunities to bring grieving kids together, it can be so powerful, because then they're not the only one. And then it's something that is a shared experience. And I think that can just be so helpful.
And that pride of sharing my loved one, like the days that they bring pictures or they show pictures, right? Just you can see the pride and the glow on their face when they share that. They share their loved one with the group.
And it's safe to do that,
That boost of self-esteem there too.
Absolutely.
Like I am still valuable. I still have meaning. I may feel broken sometimes, but that brokenness is okay.
And I can heal and I can cope.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it just has so much value, so important. Let's talk about sleep issues and how that can show up. And, we talked, again, we've addressed this a little bit, but I think there's some really big parts of grief that can show up with, maybe bad dreams or things like that.
Well, we talked earlier a little bit about sleeping and how understandably that is affected when we're grieving, because as you said, Angela, we often process our grief when things tend to slow down. And also our brain doesn't stop processing our grief even when we're asleep, and so we may find that we experience dreams that are related to our loss. For some people, those dreams may be positive. That may be something that they look for. But sometimes those dreams can also be hard. They can be really sad or really scary. And then too, even the good ones, waking up from those dreams can be challenging, because then it's that realization that kind of washes over you again. It's almost like finding out that your loved one died again for the first time, and you feel that. And so, sometimes we may have just a really bad morning because we had a difficult night the night before. And I think children, we definitely see that with children, children in general. even children who are not grieving may struggle with nightmares, and understanding those and coping with those and feeling a lot of fear in relation to those. And then, for grieving children, those nightmares may, of course, take on a much more, they may be of a much more personal nature for them. So we mentioned before that children may have some regressive behaviors when they're grieving, and that can include things like bedwetting. And we always just like to mention that so that adults know that that is a very natural and normal part of the grief experience for some kids. It is not something that's going to last forever. It's just part of where they are right now with their grief. And we just encourage you to respond just with gentleness with that. We certainly don't want to punish kids or shame them for that. Just be supportive for them, and just let them know that it will be okay, because it will.
We kind of have two more questions that families asked us to cover. And so one is it normal for my child to worry about me and our family?
Absolutely. I think that's very normal. Kids are very observant. They're usually listening, they're usually watching, and they can interpret our behavior. That's kind of their developmental job, is to watch us and learn. And so our kids know we're grieving. They see that, even if we are trying to hide it from them, they're gonna know. And so they worry about us just like we worry about them. And so that's a really normal and natural thing, to want to protect your loved one and want to care for your loved one. And that's beautiful that our children want to do that. We don't want to discourage them from doing that. And we also want them to know that they don't need to fill the role of a deceased adult. Kids will try and do that sometimes because they can see that the trash isn't being taken out. They can see that the floor isn't being vacuumed. They can see that maybe little brother or sister is acting out, and they want to help. It usually comes from this really loving, caring place. And so we want to allow our kids to help, but we also want to really reassure them, I'm still a competent parent, right? I can still care for you. I'm still going to take care of you. Everything's going to be okay. And I'm grieving. Just because I'm grieving doesn't mean your needs aren't going to be met. And of course, we say that in a age-appropriate way. But I think that's really common for kids to almost try and take a parent role. And we have to really relieve them of that duty.
Absolutely. And I think, too, we have to give ourselves permission, or again, the education to know that if a child says, well, Dad died, are you going to die, Mom? Mom, how do you answer that question? Well, you have to say, one day I will, because that's the truth. But here are all the things I do to ensure my health and safety. And I think that's really important. A lot of times I think when kids ask us that, they know the answer. They want to know if we're going to tell them.
And I think it can be very tempting for adults to say, I'm not going anywhere.
Right.
Nothing's going to happen to me.
Right.
And, I think we just want to keep in mind we don't want to make promises that we can't absolutely guarantee.
But at the same time, I think it's okay for a caregiver to say things are going to be okay,
Absolutely.
even if they're not quite sure
Yes.
how it's going to be okay
Yes.
yet. But just to give that reassurance that we're going to figure this out,
Yes.
and we are going to be okay.
I worked with a family who just had so many complicating factors to their grief, and their kind of mantra of their family was, and how they chose to respond to this, are we going to be okay, was, we're a family of love, and we're going to love each other, and we're going to do this together because we're a family of love. And there were many, many, many hard days and many, many hard conversations that they came back to that. And that's really what helped them, the adults and the children in that family. Yeah.
And something I found really helpful with kids when they worry about, is my parent or is my guardian, is my loved one going to be okay, is, all right, let's list all the things we do to keep ourselves safe.
Yes.
Let's just kind of almost make it a game. What can you think of that we do to keep ourselves safe? And it can kind of replace, it's almost a thought replacement with more helpful thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think also there are opportunities to offer reassurance about how you're coping with your grief. So we mentioned before about how important it is to model your grief for kids. But I think sometimes, too, it can also be helpful to pair that with a little bit of reassurance that what you are doing, for example, if you're having a tearful moment, that's what you're needing to do, that to take care of your grief, and putting it in that context, because it's hard to see the adults in our lives hurting. It's hard for kids to see that, and so again, we don't want to hide it from them. It's okay to show them. It's actually good to show them that, but we also want to give them some context and understanding for that, and offer them that reassurance that, yes, I'm feeling very sad right now. I'm needing to feel sad right now. It's okay for me to be sad right now, and I'm doing what I need to do to take care of myself.
That's a really good point. Gosh, you just made me think about this child that I worked with, oh my gosh, a long time ago. But she was really scared by her mom's tears because her mom was a loud crier. Her face turned red. She possibly had, a lot of things maybe coming out of her nose. I mean, she just was a full body crier kind of thing. And it scared the little girl, who was not a crier, which I just have to say, because that goes back to earlier, that not everybody's a crier. And she would say, my mom turns into a monster. And so we really had to use that language that what your mom is doing is something her body needs. Her body needs to get that. And I mean, this little girl was 7, and she didn't really like that answer, but she started understanding, that they had different needs. And so just made her come right back to me. So we talked a lot about funerals and the importance of funerals and language. That's so important. But one particular question that we get a lot, and I really felt like as we kind of start to wrap up, that we really need to give this some attention and just some good conversation, is talking about cremation with children.
Well, in my experience, caregivers are just very concerned about just approaching the conversation about cremation, just to even start the talk. And I guess what I have found is that usually after a simple, age-appropriate, direct, all the things that we've been talking about, explanation, that most children have fewer any immediate concerns or questions. And if they do, you can address those. But I think it's important to think about what you're going to say before you have the conversation, and just be mindful of when you're going to have the conversation. I said right before bed's probably not the best time. We've talked about nightmares and other things. It's probably not the best time. And if the child brings up the question and it's just you're not prepared, or it's just emotionally not a good time for you, you can always say, I'll get back with you later. But just make sure you do get back with them later. And then just remember, if you don't know the answer to some of their questions, it's okay to say, I don't know. You don't have to have all the answers. So just a few points to consider when you're having the conversation. Just be calm, be direct, and just maybe avoid words that might cause alarm, like, burned or fire, because remember, kids are very literal. Instead, you could say something like, the body's placed in a warm room and turned into soft ashes, and make it clear to them that your loved one is not hurt in any way when cremated. You might explain that when you're dead, you don't feel pain. And you might explain to them that what happens to the ashes, that some people put them in an urn, in a container, and some people put this in a very special place in their house, and they might go by and talk to that person. It's just a place to remember your loved one. And I think just after having the conversation, if they don't have any immediate questions, just reassure them that they can come back to you at any time and ask questions. And I said, just don't be surprised if after the conversation the child responds with little or no emotion and then wants to go play.
Absolutely.
Because that's how children grieve.
Right.
And I think it's important to I'm just speaking from experience with one of my clients, when we use these words like funeral and cremation to really separate those two out. I had a client one time that thought, I don't want to go to the funeral because I don't want to see my loved one burn. They thought the cremation happened at the funeral. Right. And so, explaining, well, this will happen, before the funeral or whatever that may be.
And sometimes just explaining, too, the difference. There's cremation, and then there's someone that's wishes to be buried. And sometimes that person has decided ahead of time what they want.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is probably a good place for us to look at kind of wrapping up this part of our episode for childhood and adolescent grief. We've talked a lot about the myths, how children actually show us their grief, the best ways for adults to be supportive. I think that it's important to remember that just like many adults, this might be their first encounter with grief, definitely for children, and they don't have all the tools that maybe we as adults have. I was sitting here thinking while we were talking, even just sometimes humor that children can bring in. I remember when my father died and people started showing up with food. My nephew was just in awe that people kept bringing fried chicken, and he loves fried chicken. And he was like, why do they keep bringing fried chicken? This is amazing. And then as soon as he said that, he was like, wait, I mean, it's not amazing. So I think, too, we have to remember this is all new. And it's hard for us as the grieving adults, and that's where we really need those other family members to kind of not only support us, but support our children too, because they're trying to navigate this from the fried chicken to school to changes, all throughout the family system. So as we wrap up, I'd like each of you just to kind of share, what do you think adults supporting grieving children really need to know? What would you think would be an important takeaway from this podcast?
I would say really to trust the wisdom of your child's grief. And we talked a lot about how they're very naturally healthy grievers. They're able to dose their grief, are able to lean into it and experience it and then want to go play. And so really allowing them the space to feel their feelings, allowing them the space to hurt right now in this really supportive and nurturing environment.
And I think I would just say that, like we've said before, children need structure, they need consistency, they need that routine to feel safe. And they also need some grace during this period when they're trying to navigate this, just like the caregivers need. So being patient with yourself and being patient with the child.
And I think it's just important to keep in mind that children are very resilient, especially when they are given, as Hannah mentioned, the space and the safety and the ability to express and process their grief, to openly remember their loved one, to receive wonderful support. Those are all things that contribute to that resiliency. And so just because a child has experienced a great loss does not mean that they are destined to go down a dark path. We have had the honor in doing this work of witnessing that healing. And I think what I would just want for parents and guardians of grieving children and those who love grieving children to know is that that healing is possible for them.
Absolutely. Children's grief does heal. Let me say that again. Children's grief does heal. Grief demands attention and care, and it's support and patience. Remember that grief is a reflection of love, and you're not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. So we're going to stop here, and we'll have part 2 of our conversation regarding childhood and adolescent grief. You can get that episode wherever you get your podcast. You can also learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. Barbara, Lauren, and Hannah, thank you for all that you do. Let's continue this conversation in our next episode. And to our listeners, we'll talk soon.